Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. This is Nevin Gussack, the host of the Patriotic Populist, and we're going to do part two of the Patriotic Populist on the issues. First session, we went over political reform, economics, and education, and now we're going to talk about healthcare and other social welfare policies, or social welfare related issues. When it comes to healthcare, Patriotic Populist endorses a Medicare for all system where the health insurance industry is primarily a responsibility of the federal government, and the actual dispensing of medicine and the manufacture of drugs are primarily done by the private sector in a highly competitive environment. Reason why I came to embrace a Medicare for all system, meaning a national health insurance program, is number one, health insurance companies are motivated not by necessarily dispensing or recommending or paying for the best possible care for the patient. It's all about increasing shareholder value. And that does not necessarily work for the benefit of the patient, because there are going to be a number of occasions where taking care of the patient, healing him or her, and caring for them, not always going to be the cheapest endeavor. That's number one. Healthcare system should be about preventative health, and it should be also about ensuring that the people live as long as possible with a decent quality of life in that respect. It should not be about the primacy of shareholder or majority shareholder profit. In fact, one of the things, going back to economics, that we definitely would like to incentivize in the economy is, again, to reverse this fealty to everything being about the shareholder, this notion, almost spoken with a religious-like fervor, that a company's chief mission for its existence is, or fiduciary responsibility, should be to the shareholders. Because that has not resulted necessarily in the manufacture and distribution of the best products and services necessarily, and certainly not the best working conditions and pay scales for the employees. And remember, more employees than wealthy people means more of us have money in our money to spend, essentially. There are more of us than rich people. So you want to benefit more of the middle class and working class and poor consumers than there are wealthy people. Just finished my last sip of my Pinot Noir red wine. Very, very delicious, very refreshing. I recommend it. So anyways, getting back to health insurance. If you don't believe me regarding the absolute immorality, corruption, callousness, many of the large health insurance companies, I encourage you to Google a gentleman by the name of Wendell Potter. He used to work as a vice president and a lobbyist, I believe, for major health insurance corporations like Cigna. I would take a look at that and then come back and comment and regarding the necessity of health insurance reform to all you doubters out there who are wetting their pants about the prospect of quote unquote socialized medicine. Because we do not call for the government ownership of the entire healthcare system. We do not call for the government operation of the entire healthcare system. What we want to do is essentially prevent the health insurance industry from coming in between the doctor, which you hopefully like and have been using for years, and the patient. Now, these conservatives and the libertarians, many of them, talk about the big bad government, the federal government, this socialist, communist monstrosity that comes in between the doctor and the patient. Doesn't happen. I've asked my daughter's doctors, I've asked my own doctors, and I see several. Their thoughts on that. And the biggest complaint they have is with the health insurance companies. And I have personal experience with that. And there's tremendous amounts of bureaucracy and red tape associated with the health insurance companies. And on the flip side, what do seniors say about Medicare? Well, the ones that I've talked to love Medicare. And there are polls out there that show that our senior citizens, that our elderly Americans overwhelmingly love Medicare, both for cost controls, meaning low costs, and the ease of retaining your doctors and dealing with your doctors. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. The only two things that really corrupt the conversation about healthcare reform are libertarian, quote, free market fundamentalist ideology, this social Darwinist notion that we're not our brother's keeper, that therefore healthcare is not a right, it should be a privilege based on the ability to pay, which, let's not bullshit ourselves. That's a callous viewpoint. Think about it. And thirdly, it's corporate special interest money by the health insurance industries. From their perspective, they don't want to lose out. They have everything to lose and nothing to gain in a national health insurance program, a Medicare for all scheme. That's at the heart of this. Where we do differentiate ourselves from is healthcare systems as communist countries. Cuba's healthcare system, and I wrote a paper for a very conservative right-wing organization called Bear Witness Central, and I wrote a paper on the healthcare system in Cuba, and I cite defectors, medical defectors, meaning doctors and other health officials from the Cuban National Health Insurance, which clearly indicates that the health system, the communist healthcare system in Cuba, in many respects is fraught with problems. In many ways, it's a disaster. Yes, they do have product innovation for various drugs and I think even medical equipment, but generally the population, from what I understand, doesn't see those benefits, certainly not on an equal basis. The cutting advances in the advances in Cuban healthcare, it seems, goes to foreign tourists with hard currency, as well as the government and party elite in Cuba, the ruling Cuban Communist Party. Because in a communist society, healthcare, like other welfare services, are used as levers to control the population and ensure compliance and loyalty to the party and the state. We absolutely oppose that. Our system of healthcare, which involves a greater degree of state interventionism in certain areas, is not going to resemble that of Cuba. We do not want that. Our concern is preserving life and health as much as possible and ensuring people truly have access to that, both preventative health as well as also literally if they face a major health crisis. That means we got your back. And that's where our tax dollars are going to go, where actually people see the tangible fruits of their tax money. Yes, very true. When we take a look at healthcare, we want to ensure and examine why more and more private health practices have become centralized. Down here in Florida, you have pediatric associates. We would like to see why that's slowly monopolized, and we're going to take a look at it. And we're going to see how we can get back to a period where you have a lot of a proliferation of small health practices. We want to get back to that time because those individual health practices are pillars in the community, where who you use years and years and years for your children, yourself. You're on a first name basis, of course, with your doctor. They know everything about you. It creates a sense of community, and they understand you. They understand your health conditions. It's not another faceless bureaucracy. So we're going to take a look at policies and why the provision of healthcare has become slowly but surely monopolized. Because we want to get back to, back to a period where we have even more of the smaller health practices. Not to say they don't exist, but we want to get back to the point where we didn't have pediatric associates and other semi-monopoly health practices or doctors' practices, if you will. We also want to take a look at the fact that that the hospitals used to be run, from what I understand, on a more of a nonprofit basis. Even health insurance companies used to be run on a nonprofit basis until President Nixon and Reagan started to reverse that state of affairs. Nixon, if I remember correctly, with the development of the HMO system, health insurance started to run on a for-profit basis. And hospitals, over time, by the 1980s, 1990s, started to work on a for-profit basis. And you had large companies that started to buy out these hospitals and maintain chains of hospitals. We need to take a look at that. We need to take a look at also restoring hospitals, for the most part, to being nonprofit institutions. Private, yes, but nonprofit. We need to take a look at that. I would be okay even with potentially taking a look at health insurance companies and revising them, restoring them to nonprofit entities. We might not even need to go to a national health insurance program. That might help. But again, one of the biggest problems in healthcare, again, is how expensive it is. And the health insurance companies, the large health insurance companies, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, notably United Healthcare, you have executives collecting massive salaries, massive amounts of money, tremendous amounts of funds. Some of the biggest costs associated with health insurance is advertising. That's money that could be freed up for research. It could be freed up for actually paying for services for the patients. It could be used for a number of different things. But instead, it's eaten up in areas that have nothing to do with health or care. So let's take a look at Medicare for All, meaning a national health insurance program. Let's take a look at revising corporate law and corporate attitudes and restoring hospitals and especially health insurance companies to being nonprofit entities. Another thing that I would do is definitely do a national program of education that would involve TV advertisements, reinforcement in dominant culture, amongst other things, to promote fitness, physical fitness, exercising. That's something I would promote. I would promote that, of course, much more aggressively in grade schools and high school. I would also take a look through either our new reconfiguration of the health insurance industry or even a new national health insurance program. I would use that to incentivize gym membership by the American public. And it's very important to incentivize preventative health, physicals, physical exams, blood tests, of which that's a part of, urine tests, taking a look at, cleaning your teeth at your dentist, all of that, preventative health, that's something that should be covered. Look at it on a practical level. When you're sick and not healthy, that takes people out of the workforce. That's not very efficient. Another problem associated with the current health system based on corporate capitalism, undiluted, unrestrained corporate capitalism. Another problem is that almost half of our country's bankruptcies result from medical bills. The provisioning of medicine, the provisioning of healthcare is extremely expensive. And it's not because of big government. It's because, again, health insurance is predicated on increasing shareholder value. And the shareholders who own stock in health care companies and the ones who benefit the most, the shareholders that benefit the most are what are known as majority shareholders. That's really, in my opinion, that's a lot of what it comes down to. Big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry. Well, we need to retain a pharmaceutical industry where we produce our drugs. And on another point, especially in light of COVID-19, not only do we need to produce our own drugs and medicines within the borders of the United States, but we also need to produce our own medical equipment, and that includes PPEs, masks, etc. That's something we should not be producing in foreign countries, and especially a hostile government, China, communist China. That's absolute insanity. But with big pharma, if we do have a national health insurance program, which I do support, we need to also have the ability for the federal government, the Medicare that oversees Medicare, well, they need to have the ability to negotiate drug prices from the private pharmaceutical industry. That's something that Billy Tauzin, a congressman from Louisiana, George W. Bush, and that corporate horror, pro-corporate horror of an administration, they need to negotiate that downwards. Okay? They need to negotiate that downwards. That will save the American taxpayer, the American citizens of all classes and races and genders, quite a bit of money. So we need to take a look at that. We need to implement that, not just merely take a look at it, we got to implement it. Health insurance accounts is promoted by many Republicans, including the Libertarian Republican Rand Paul. That's nonsense. That is bullshit. That's basically pretending to do something, which in reality is not substantive. Where are the average people going to get money to put money in a health savings account to pay for even basic medical services? Blood tests, very expensive. And the average individual in America, about 40 some odd percent of Americans can't even afford a $400 emergency. 60% of Americans can't afford a $1,000 emergency. Now, I'm fortunate in that I'm not in that category, at least for now, but many Americans obviously are. So where does Rand Paul and all these other Tea Party, libertarian, conservative Reaganites, what planet are they living on? I mean, those solutions are dishonest because it's just not based in the financial reality of many Americans. Half of the Americans are going bankrupt because almost half of Americans are going to bankruptcy because of medical bills, and you expect or hope people to put money away in an HSA, health savings accounts, to pay for preventative medical procedures, as well as, God forbid, if they get sick or contract some illness. Give me a break. Just Rand Paul and all your other conservatives and lowberts, which is a term for libertarians, just stick a lot of your solutions up your ass and just get out of the conversation. Because you guys, in general, what it comes down to is you're shilling for the private health insurance industry and big pharma. And we'll include also corporate Democrats, by the way, in this. Because they're not innocent in this regard either. So those are some of our positions regarding healthcare. And I think Herschel would probably agree with this, or much of what I'm saying here. Other social welfare social welfare programs, well, if we tighten up our labor market by making our trade and immigration policies and union organizing policies more favorable to the American worker and to our national sovereignty, what's going to happen is that will bump wages upwards. And when you have a larger presence of unions in the United States in the American workplace, as long as they're not, being led by people that just want to throw out capitalism in its entirety, that's going to be a nice complement to the free enterprise system, and that's going to really raise wages. I mean, that's going to help. There was a period in 1948, there was a study done by the Joint Economic Committee, the Joint Committee on Economics or something or another by the U.S. Congress. And this was a period during, we were still living under the New Deal at its height. There was a tremendous amount of unionization and union organizing drives in the United States. And the study showed statistically that the incomes of all social classes, from the poor and the workers all the way to the upper classes, were all profiting. Everyone was doing well. And it's not just because we just came out of the war and therefore we had to produce a lot of goods to reconstruct Western Europe. That's not the entire reason. Okay? It was because of national policies that we took. Okay? That trickled downwards, truly trickled downwards to the American population. Or as Nick Hanauer and others will put it, was the result of the incentivizing of bottom-up economic policies or growth. That's how you make the capitalist system work for the American public. More people, a lot of workers, a lot of employees, a lot of working and middle income people and poor people. There are a lot of us. We put money on our hands. We're going to save. We're going to spend it. We're going to invest it. More of us, just mathematics. I don't understand what the big deal is. So anyways, moving back to the issue, of course, I digressed. Moving back to the issue of social welfare policies, if you have more people in unions, that means more income. That means more people less dependent on food stamps, Section 8 housing, and other transfer payments that allow people to survive. It means that more people are going to be independent of the government, which means that the money and funds expended by state, local, and federal governments on welfare expenses are going to lower. So the budget is actually going to cut itself. And that means money that can be refunded to the taxpayer. It could be used to fund infrastructure programs, a national health insurance program, revitalizing aspects of our defense forces that need to be modernized or updated. Or it could be put into a rainy day fund and saved in case of a major emergency. There's a lot of things we can do with that excess money. So we covered healthcare. We covered the fact that that federal policies which encourage a tighter labor market, meaning reducing and eventually even eliminating various work visa programs, disincentivizing outsourcing, reversing our unilateral free trade policies, and therefore utilizing tariffs, quotas, and other investments to boost our industrial manufacturing, mining bases, family farms. That's going to tighten up the labor market. That's going to raise incomes, and especially getting rid of right to work. That's going to be a very big thing, and which will therefore increase the percentage of American workers being unionized and represented by unions. And that means people, again, will not have to rely on social welfare benefits, food stamps, Section 8, WIC, and a variety of other programs. So that welfare budget is going to cut itself rather than taking the callous, conservative, libertarian Tea Party approach and just do the drug testing and stigmatize welfare recipients and all the rest of it as parasites and everything else. That's just class warfare from the right. That's nonsense. So that's something we don't support at all. So we talked about social welfare programs. I mean, we're obviously going to have programs in existence to allow people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, because this bootstraps argument is partially mythical. You need resources in order to better yourself with education, to get certain educations and certifications. You need money. It's relying on this, pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps. I mean, that's just nonsensical. People need resources to better themselves. People need the right attitude and say to themselves, I want to better myself. And you have to have a population that wants to take responsibility. And many people do take responsibility, but they also need access to resources, to funds, in order to reach their goals, in order to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and become socially mobile. We also need to take a look at reversing the Reagan policy of eliminating housing subsidies to make housing more affordable. One of the challenges that are faced by struggling families, trying to prevent going into homelessness, is affording. When they rent an apartment or rent a condo or home, they have to pay the deposit, they have to pay the first and last month's rent. And in a situation where only 40% of people can cover a $400 expense, or 60% of Americans covering $1,000 expense, not being able to cover, 40% not being able to cover $400 expense, or 60% of Americans not being able to afford $1,000 expense, how do you expect them to afford what could be a couple of $1,000s worth of expenses associated with just renting an apartment or renting a condo or a home? I mean, think about that. So we need to look at programs that allow people, whether through a low interest or no interest loan, or grants that allow people, that'll make it easier for people to help pay for those expenses. And if need be, to give them skin in the game, to pay it back a nominal amount over X number of years. That's something that should be looked at. One of the reasons why that homelessness expanded is a lot of affordable housing programs or housing assistance has been severely cut, and that started under the Reagan administration. And homelessness was treated more, even by our media, as well as much of our political class, particularly on the right, as more of a personal failing. And that's not always the case. So we have to look at that problem honestly. And a lot of that, again, goes back to also improving wages and salaries, as well as also programs too, as well, and implementing programs. And we need to take a look at also how these big companies like Invitation Homes, which is a subsidiary of, I think, BlackRock or Blackstone, major Wall Street investment firm, in the wake of the Great Recession, they bought up all these vacant homes or foreclosed homes and rented it out to people. Well, just read about it, what goes on in California and other states with Invitation Homes. It's a disaster. Horrible customer service. Again, it's all about shareholder value. So if they're going to cut corners on repairs, extermination of deadly insects at times, they're going to cut corners. We need to go back to a situation where it's more the individual landowners owning maybe a couple of properties. But this notion of a big company owning literally hundreds, if not thousands, of homes or apartments, that needs to be looked at and needs to be reversed. That's another area where trust busting is absolutely necessary, because you develop, again, with your landlords, you tend to have the potential for developing more of a personal relationship. So if you have a decent landlord and you fall on hard times and you are a good tenant, it's more of a chance, there's more of a better chance that you have when negotiating with your landlord, maybe a little respite, than a big faceless company. Makes sense, doesn't it? That combined with, a situation, a labor market that encourages, higher wages and salaries, and also some housing programs that addresses even working people encountering financial difficulties. I think those are all things that need to be implemented. And they were at one time, those policies were at one time the reality in the United States to some degree. So we need to look at that, look at restoring those situations. I mean, you're never going to get rid of the housing market and supply and demand, but there are things that can be done, as I said before, to ameliorate that. And that's another thing we can look at: rent control, which of course has always been opposed by the real estate lobby. But with our political reforms, our congressmen and senators and state legislatures and local governments, they're going to be independent of all these campaign contributions. So they'll be able to make a decision based on the merits of a particular policy, as well as serving truly the public good and balancing competing interests. I went over infrastructure and economy, some of the social welfare policies. I think you have an understanding, at least, of where I stand. Now we're going to explore reindustrialization, which I probably should have talked about in economy. There are going to be a couple of policies that were at one time in existence in the United States, and certainly in other countries around the world, that have been used to encourage industrial development. To back up, there are 6 sources of national wealth: manufacturing, mining, agriculture, which should be demonopolized or trust busted back to a situation where the majority of agricultural production, at least half of it, is reverted back to family farms. That needs to be pursued. By the way, a little side point. But 6 sources of wealth: mining, manufacturing, agriculture, and research, development, education, and infrastructure. That should be the 6 sources of wealth. One of the important areas is, of course, mining. Yes, we need to really limit our reliance on China and Russia, especially for importation of key minerals, oil, and other important commodities that can be extracted from American territory. That really needs to be reversed over a period of several years. And if companies find that too expensive, if the federal government has to come in and nationalize and create government corporations, well, which is more important, our national security, national survival, and not being reliant on communist China and sort of this neo-KGB dictatorship in Russia for our minerals, or free market? Again, which is more important for you? This misplaced notion of property supremacy, of fealty to the free market, that, I'm afraid of government, of big government, because I believe in Ronald Reagan's, stupid rhetoric of government is always the problem? Or do you take a non-ideological approach and say, which is more important is national security and national survival and national sovereignty? And this is what a lot of the movement conservatives, they just don't get it. They think they could have a strong national defense and at the same time import parts and key minerals and manufactured goods from around the world to help feed our national defense forces. That's nonsense. We Patriotic populists, radical civic nationalists are much more consistent on that. The world is not a reliable or kind place. So we have to think creatively. We can't enact policy based on ideological silos and be afraid to look at other alternatives because it defies our ideology or defies our orthodoxy. Because at the end of the day, the two or three most important things or values in governing from a patriotic populist point of view is fealty to the public good while balancing that with individual preserving individual freedoms to a large extent and individualism, as well as also preserving our national security and our national sovereignty. Those are the most important things, thereby creating a stronger nation, a stronger country. So that's where I come from with mining, with my policies regarding mining. Next, what I would do is with agriculture, I would take a look at policies to break up the large agribusinesses. For example, some of them exist, I'm sure, like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill and these other mega corporations involved in agriculture and farming. And I would really revert back to enacting policies that allow for more of a proliferation of the family farms. Another very battered sector of the American economy that's battered by corporate cartelization, meaning centralization and monopolization. The big banks have hit in regards to loans, the family farmers, and also, as I said, the big agribusinesses, because they're dependent on big agribusinesses for purchasing of tools and equipment and marketing of products. It's a very intricate issue. I encourage you all to read about the different factors, and conditions that plague the family farmer. Family farmers, not only do they more often or not tend to produce really good products, but they're also very positive factors in the community and developing a sense of community and social cohesion in different parts of the country, different towns and villages. And I think that goes without saying. So I would look at the revitalization of the family farm through tough policies enacted towards, commercial as well as especially investment banks, as well as large agricultural cartels or corporations like ADM, Cargill, and others. When it comes to manufacturing, there are three ways we're going to revitalize American manufacturing to restore dormant or struggling industrial sectors. Number one, through tariffs and quotas. But that's not the only way to do it. It's just a starting point. And we're going to incrementally raise the tariffs. We're not going to just put tomorrow 50% on all imported goods. I'm not going to do that. Why? Because you need to raise the investment capital to build the new factories and recruit and pay the workforce. And this is where, to take an idea originally propounded by Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary, we're going to nationalize essentially the Federal Reserve. I mean, Federal Reserve was created in 1913, long after the time of Alexander Hamilton. But we're going to create essentially a third national bank, is what I would call it. And it would be the result of a nationalized Federal Reserve. And one of the jobs of this nationalized Federal Reserve is to disperse credits for for the reestablishment of long dormant or struggling industrial sectors. Autos, textiles, trucks, steel, electronics, other consumer goods, things that we need to function as a country. Another one, machine tools, Very important for any civilized industrial society. Very, very important. So you have the tariffs, and I would keep the tariffs at about a historical average of 20%. Let's keep it at that. We'll raise it incrementally, keep it about 20 or 25%. And we'll also put in quotas. Quotas will be a way of easing off of these unilateral free trade policies that allow various foreign countries, foreign governments, foreign companies, with the encouragement of their governments, to dump goods into the American market. So we're going to, that's another thing. Get the nationalized Federal Reserve, the Third National Bank, tariffs and quotas. And we're also, as I mentioned previously, we're going to, as society, as our taxpayers, because we are our brother's keeper, and we have to stick together and work together to preserve our nation. We're also going to pay for certain college and university majors that are needed in the reindustrialization effort. And that would include engineering, medicine, physics, certain vocational technical majors like welding, for example, operation of lathes and other machine tools, biology, all these majors that are needed for the reindustrialization of the United States and development of innovative technologies. And of course, we would impose tariffs. We would give multinational corporations 5 years to repatriate their production back to the United States. Otherwise, they'll be faced with 100% tariffs. We will also assist in the export of goods to foreign countries. Those goods are not going to be taxed. The exports are not going to be taxed. And we will continue to fund, even generously, the Export-Import Bank. But we will not export goods to hostile governments, Russia, China, and others. So that's what we're going to do with that. We are going to also obviously continue to invest in research and development. We have robust efforts at scientific research and development. We're going to continue that. Many other countries do that. They have not devolved into totalitarian or authoritarian tyrannies. So it's not like this leapfrogging to socialism. So this is something that the United States has done with successes for quite a long time. Furthermore, what we're going to do moving forward is we are going to take a look, excuse me, getting a little tired as I'm speaking for almost 2 hours on a variety of things. And I mean, I could speak a lot more in detail, but obviously that would triple our time, and then I'd be reading all kinds of statistics from my book that I collected for years and years and years. So I think I'm just going to kind of stop right here when it comes to reindustrialization, as well as mining and agriculture, infrastructure, and whatnot. And we're going to move to foreign policy and national security policy. That is something that probably is my biggest strength, is the biggest topic that I've written about. So what I would do is, national security is not just merely building up in the high-quality, well-trained, and well-equipped military to protect the United States. Defense policy, what we would do is protecting the home front is going to be the most important part, is the most important component of national defense. Our biggest threats are the combined alliance of Russia and China. The Cold War did not end. The Communist Party, Soviet Union repositioned themselves. They still are controlled behind the scenes. Putin, on occasion, the president and dictator of the Russian Federation, at times has admitted his fealty towards communism and to the Soviet era. With the, quote, collapse of communism in December 1991, the Russians continue to support their adversaries throughout the world, American adversaries throughout the world, Iraq, even a little bit Cuba, Venezuela, Angola and Yugoslavia under Slobodan Milosevic, Iran, Syria, Nicaragua, now back under Sandinista control, etc. The Russians continue to develop or undertake war exercises, military exercises that are directly directed against the United States. By 2001, they were conducting joint exercises, which continued to this day with the People's Republic of China, Communist China. The successors to the KGB, the SVR, continues to commit espionage against the Western powers and NATO countries, including the United States. In fact, defectors from the SVR, from the Russian SVR, have confirmed that actually their operations have been even more aggressive than even during the Cold War. Defectors from Russian military intelligence, the GRU, the SVR, and even the Russian military have confirmed that the Russian government under Yeltsin and Putin are continuing war plans against the United States. In fact, GRU Colonel Stanislav Lunev has confirmed in 1992 the Clinton administration, the incoming Clinton administration, kind of did not welcome his revelations because we had a detente with Yeltsin. We were willfully blind to the reality of Russia at the time, that it did not become a necessarily friendly country to the United States. But anyway, so Lunev revealed that the Russian war plan against the United States was still on, that China would occupy the lower 48 of the United States by agreement with the Russians, and that third world countries would be invited for quote unquote what he termed looting rights. Essentially, they would despoil the United States of resources and technology, presumably. That Russia would also re-annex Alaska, which was a staple of Soviet war planning during the Cold War, as confirmed by a Czechoslovakian military defector and a Russian Red Army military defector. So all of this, plus more proof that I'm just not going to go into for the sake of time, shows that Russia clearly, that the United States remained the main enemy of Russia, even after the, quote, collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party Soviet Union, they repositioned themselves for years beforehand, indicating that there was a plan to possibly collapse the communist system and convert it into this sort of ostensibly non-communist, semi-authoritarian regime that would masquerade as a democracy, but where the Communist Party nomenclature would still have control, reconverted as oligarchs, and other industries still owned by the state, incidentally, by the Russian government. In China, China is still a hardline Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. They are openly communist. They still view the United States as a long-term and short-term enemy. They support a variety of anti-American governments and even terrorist movements throughout the world. I document that in my books available on Amazon. Very, very, very important. Very, very important. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out my books on Amazon.com, because for the sake of time, I don't have the time to go over how China has harmed American policy. It's very well documented. in that regard. They do have war plans against the United States. Look up General Chi Hao-shin's speech dated from 2005 regarding their invasion plans against the United States by depopulating the United States using biological warfare. So China clearly has aggressive intentions against the United States, and we need to meet that, not through a shooting war or provoking anything, but being prepared. Being prepared for, God forbid, if there is a conflict. So that's really, really, really important. Once we have that realization, we can now proceed in enacting policies that will protect the American homeland. And that would include revitalizing our shelf life of our nuclear weapons. I don't like nuclear weapons, but the fact of the matter is we need to retain them. God forbid we need to use them very selectively, and that would be an absolute last resort. The last resort. Secondly, what I would do is I would really revitalize our missile defense program. Very, very important. This way we can protect our most important resource, our most important asset, which is our people, to protect life against, God forbid, an incoming attack of ICBMs or SLBMs, or short-range ballistic missiles or medium-range ballistic missiles. I would also ensure that we have a massive reserve of antidotes and medicines and other drugs and protective equipment that would, God forbid, if there was a biological or chemical warfare attack against the United States, to ensure that the population is inoculated or protected against that, so that we don't have millions and millions killed. We try to prevent that and try and save as many lives as possible. And the anti-missile system, by the way, that would be developed, we would look at laser systems, we would look at interceptor aircraft, we would look at anti-ballistic ABM missile systems, and really take a look at the ABM treaty. Another thing that I would make sure is that our troop levels, tank levels, artillery gun levels, I would make sure that those numbers are at parity, if not superiority, to Russia and China, even combined. I would also bring back to our shores in its entirety over a period of 5 years, 5 to 10 years, our entire defense industrial base. We should not be importing products used by our defense forces from foreign countries, because that involves vulnerable sea lanes that could be attacked in wartime, or vulnerable airspace where transport aircraft could, God forbid, be shot out of the sky too as well. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. We need to repatriate our defense industry back to the shores of the United States and produce our own ordnance, our own ammunition, all the components used in planes and tanks and artillery and uniforms, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really, really important thing. Another thing that I would do is also really readdress our trade policy. We should not be importing critical goods, let alone everyday consumer goods, from enemy countries, and we should not be exporting valuable dual-use technologies, weapons, and many other dual-use goods that could potentially be used for military intelligence operations to governments and military forces and industries in Russia and China and Vietnam and Myanmar, used to be known as Burma, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria. I would even take a look at also the trade with South Africa, which ever since the fall of the apartheid fascist dictatorship has been taken over in part by the ANC in cooperation with the South African Communist Party. And they have indicated fealty towards an alliance with Russia and China. So those are some examples. Belarus, where we sell a lot of computers through big tech. That's another country we should not be trading high technology with. So we need to get our trade policy in order too as well. And we need to also gently lean on our European allies, our NATO allies also, to abandon this longstanding practice of transferring at times weapons as well as dual use technologies, industrial machinery, computers, etc., to China and Russia, Iran for its nuclear programs, example, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to really take a look at that. And one thing I would do is I would also I would undertake steps and examine steps to revoke permanent normal trade relations for the Russian Federation under Putin, the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party, and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, also governed by its Communist Party. I would really take a look at revoking PNTR, which is permanent normal trade relations. One of the biggest mistakes in American policies. Arms control, my position is it's a very noble goal, but the reality is you can't verify compliance with arms control treaties with very untrustworthy governments. The government in Russia, the old Soviet Union, China, they're notorious for violating agreements. Signing diplomatic and peace agreements and arms control agreements as defectors from the Soviet military and government, and even Russia, the Iranian government, look at the Revolutionary Guard defector and other defectors, Reza Khalili and others. They talk about how negotiations is just a part of war. It's a part of battle to gain advantages for the dictators in Tehran, in Moscow, in Beijing, and other capitals where you have rather hostile governments. So while arms control agreements are very noble in intention, the reality is the world is not a nice place. And we have to do what we need to do to protect ourselves. Okay? Doesn't mean shooting missiles at Russia and China. It's the last thing I want to do. I don't want to do that. I just want to protect our population. Leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and that's it. And I would make sure, of course, our Navy is beefed up. President Trump did have a plan, at least on paper, to beef up the amount of naval vessels that we had in our inventory. That is something that I support as well. So moving forward, one area of defense policy that I kind of take into account from the left, where they have a good point, is the costs of our interventionism throughout the world, the sort of neoconservative interventionism, as well as also the very, very high costs, the cost overruns, the corruption and fraud with defense spending. And my book, Turning the Page, discusses that in some detail. And what we would do is we would take a hard look at our naval bases, or rather our military bases abroad, and we would say to ourselves, well, which bases in what countries are vulnerable to being overrun or attacked by the Russians and or the Chinese? Well, I've thought about this in great detail. And what I would do is I would retain air and naval bases selectively in certain Western European countries, notably Germany, Italy, and the UK, for starters. What I would do, and Greece. What I would also do is take a look at also, or actually not take a look, but actually continue to afford military protection to South Korea to prevent an attack by North Korea. And I would also look at redeveloping a base in Taiwan, or at least have American naval vessels patrolling near Taiwan to send a message to Beijing that we got Taiwan's back. We're not going to just let the People's Liberation Army of China just overrun or threaten Taiwan. Doesn't mean we're going to attack China by sending the ships and shell Taiwan or launch cruise missiles, to China, or shell using naval guns on ships to attack the PRC. No, but we want to send a message that we have Taiwan's back. And if it comes down to it, if Beijing, God forbid, is really aggressive, we're going to be talking about reestablishing a military base or two in Taiwan and patrolling the Taiwan Straits, which we used to do until Nixon's rapprochement with the People's Republic of China. So those are some potential choke points that we would continue to maintain naval bases. And we would also look at increasing and beefing up the bases on the Gulf Coast of the United States. Why? Because Latin America, some of the Latin American countries are moving to the left. I mean, the hard left, the communist left. Nicaragua is back to being governed by the communists under the Sandinista movement. You have Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. You have Cuba still, which is becoming a base again somewhat for Russia and even China. El Salvador has moved in out of the the Russian and Chinese orbit under the FMLN, which was a terrorist movement that has become more of a political movement, which still retains its anti-American sentiments to a large degree. Brazil was governed at one point by the Workers' Party, which was a Marxist-leaning party that was against the United States. However, Jair Bolsonaro, who is a sort of corporate neoliberal, took over. And while he's very anti-communist, he has created some unique problems for Brazil. His attempted approaches by some in his government to privatize strategic resources and launch these sort of libertarian free market reforms, which typically radicalizes the masses towards the left, as well as also backpedaling on his deep suspicion towards investments in Brazil and trade with Brazil with communist China. So there's a potential opening to the left too as well. The Workers' Party and the Brazilian left has really from the get-go has been hostile to Bolsonaro and the forces of the Brazilian corporate or free market right. So Latin America is, some of the countries have, and Bolivia, it looks like is going back to Marxist communist forces of Evo Morales, who has admitted, like Daniel Ortega, Cuba's Castro, and others, of being Marxist and Marxist-Leninists. So that's what's going on with that. So we want to keep an eye just on things in Latin America to make sure that, God forbid, we don't have a Red Dawn scenario down the line because we were asleep at the wheel and we allowed these different revolutions, which replaces, yes, neoliberalism, which is not a good thing for the third world, with forms of Marxism or extreme left ideologies that are aligned with Russia and China against the, quote, imperialist empire. So we need to really look at beefing up some of our military bases on the Gulf Coast and in the east coast of Florida. So God forbid, if we need a rapid response to an extreme threat in our hemisphere, we can act upon that. What we also need to do is really take a hard look and negotiate with private defense contractors who produce weapons and contract services, et cetera, to really lower their prices where, yes, they can make a profit, but at the same time, not charge the taxpayers such a high amount of money. I mean, there have been studies which shows that cost overruns, fraud, in military contracting, unaccounted for money, is totaled to the billions, even trillions of dollars. That our foreign involvements overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq alone, at least $5 or $6 trillion. All of this needs to be really, really re-examined. And before we start really increasing or decreasing the military budget, we need a full audit of the DoD's expenses, some of which will not, for obvious reasons of preserving secrecy, will not be openly publicized, but needs to be gone through from top to bottom. And if the defense contractors don't want to renegotiate prices at a lower rate for ordnance, for services, for weapons, then we have to seriously consider buying them out, nationalizing them, and giving them a level of compensation. And there are industries in the United States that are government owned that produce weapons to begin with. For example, the tank factory, the M1 tank factory in Lima, Ohio, is an entirely government owned corporation. And other NATO and free countries do produce weapons in government owned factories. It's not unknown. So that's what I would take a look at, because the military industrial complex, while it is necessary, at the same time, we should not ignore the corruption and the overspending and the unaccounted monies associated with this. Because all of that money can be reallocated towards, for example, beefing up our almost non-existent civil defense to protect our population. God forbid if there's a major global conflict that affects the continental United States, or CONUS in military parlance. Let's see what else I can think of. Well, I think that pretty much covers quite a bit of material here. So I see I got some messages over there from a John Lawrence. Thank you so much for listening. I am going to write to you or respond to you. I encourage you, John, as well as others, to subscribe to this podcast. And I want to thank everybody. For those of you who are listening right now, I want to thank you for listening to this program. I really appreciate it. Make sure you tell me if you like this podcast, you like what I have to say, as well as what Herschel has to say. Feel free to comment. Even if you don't agree with something, that's fine. Just be polite, professional. We'll try to answer you the best we can. Either way, we thank you for listening. We hope that you listen again in the future. Take care. God bless America. Stay healthy and stay safe, and Happy New Year.